Thank you very much, Ravi, and thank you very much, Ambassador Rao, for agreeing to do this. I could not have hoped for a better interlocutor. First, just a shout out to the city of Bangalore or Bengaluru. I spent the morning signing books, and I have not yet seen a city with such a fine reading culture. I've been traveling all across India, but the enthusiasm I saw for books here. I went to Church Street. I don't know Bangalore very well, and I kept asking every bookstore, I said, how are there so many stores on the same street? And they all said, well, everybody here loves to read. So that was very, very heartening to hear, and it's lovely to see that all of you have made an effort on a weekend to come. So a big thank you to you. I just want to preempt something that some of you might have felt before you decided whether you wanted to come. And that must have been a feeling that, do we really want to talk any more about COVID? Right? Raise your hand if you have that feeling. Yeah, some of you do. And I understand it. I understand it because I have it too. My life has been nothing but 2 years of documenting COVID. I lost my father to COVID. I got COVID. Professionally, personally, this has been all that I have lived for 2 years. And yet, as much as I try and block it out and move on, one of the things that I realized was that there is no moving on without experiencing the emotion that is subliminally there. And if we try and move on by blocking out what happened, by pretending it didn't happen, by denialism, then sooner or later it catches up with us. So my reason for writing this book, actually, I had 2 or 3 reasons for writing this book. One is that many of us may not be ready emotionally to read this book right now because it's too close to what happened. Many of us have suffered, or we've known people who've suffered, or if we were lucky enough not to suffer, we're like so glad we didn't suffer, we don't want to remember anything. But there will be a time when this moment in history will need to be revisited and understood because it was an inflection point, not just in our history, but in the world's history. So one is, as a chronicler, I felt it was my duty to write it. But in many ways, for me, this is not a book about COVID, the virus, or COVID, the pandemic. This is a book about we the people. This is a book about our country. This is a book about us as people, what works, what doesn't work in our systems, what the inequities are, what the moments of heartbreak are, but also what the moments for hope are. And in many ways, I feel that if you do take the care to read this book, you will find some reflection of your life in this book. And which is why I call it Humans of COVID, because it is about the people. It's not about policy. It's not about science. There are better books on that. There are people better qualified to write those books. This is just a book about all of us. It's a book about the lives we lived and the people I met while I traveled across the country for this pandemic. I don't know if this is actually working. Okay. So just to give you a sense of how this journey started for me, the Prime Minister had just announced the national lockdown. And remember, this was the world's largest lockdown. It was 1.3 billion people who were being asked to stay at home. And at the time, it seemed to make perfect sense. After all, most of the world was doing exactly the same. And I just happened to say, okay, let me wander out and see what is happening at the borders of Delhi where I live. And as I went to the border, I suddenly found, on the first day itself, men, women, and little children. The children were often barefoot. The women were carrying their entire universe tied into this little sari, potli as it were, like a sack made from their sari cloth on their heads. And the men, no food, no water, maybe just a little plastic water, a packet of Parle-G at most, walking. And I asked them, where are you going? And they said, we're going home. And I said, why? They said, well, they were all daily wages. They had immediately lost income. And like you and me, they wanted to be with the people they loved in a moment of crisis when they didn't know whether they were going to live or die. One of the assumptions that we made was that the poor only cared about economic sustenance and they didn't have any emotional needs. It was a patronizing sort of assumption about India's poor. Many people needed to be home because they had no other way to live economically, but many people simply needed to be home just the way you and I would want to be with the people we love most if we actually feel like it's the end of the world, which is what it felt like, at least in that first wave. And so began my sort of journey with the pandemic. And everywhere I would go for the first maybe 45 days, I would find the great paradox of this pandemic. The Indian state was either absent, so you had all of these people walking with their little belongings, barefoot, and there was nobody. Nobody. And literally there wasn't even, I'm a child of television, I didn't see any TV channels there. There were a handful of photographers and some of us from the digital media, independent journalists, and some local reporters from small towns. And we would meet people like this man carrying his 5-year-old infant walking 700 kilometers home. And there was just an absent state. When I say an absent state, no police, no bureaucracy, no officials, nothing, just an absent state. When the panic started, oh my God, these people are leaving, would they be carrying the virus with them? Let's try and stop them. Then we had this sort of rule from the top saying, let's stop them. Anyone who leaves should be stopped by the police. So we suddenly weaponized the police in an otherwise absent state against the most powerless people in our country. And again, the great paradox of our country is that the police itself was vulnerable at the front line. The police itself, the police constable, was liable to get COVID. But when the police force was weaponized against these poor people, these are the sort of blisters you can see on the barefoot feet of one of the women who were walking, then so many people I met actually, more than the virus, more than how to get home, because they had mentally made up their mind to walk those hundreds of kilometers home, had been beaten by the police repeatedly. And I'll tell you the story, and you can just keep the slides, I think, going. I think the images tell their own story. I met a man outside one of the big public hospitals in Delhi, and he was sitting outside leaning against a yellow police barricade, which is the color of the Delhi police, and he was weeping. And I walked up to him and I said, what has happened to you? And he said, I'm a rickshaw driver, and I got beaten by the police and left here on the road. So I said, why were you beaten by the police? And he said, because, I haven't had any work. I drive a rickshaw because of the lockdown. There's no work. I had to feed my children. But the vegetables that were being sold at the retail grocery next to my house were too expensive. So I thought if I walk to the wholesale market, maybe I'll get them for cheap. But that led me to be in violation of the so-called curfew. And that was the big mistake we made in the first wave, that we treated the lockdown, which should have really been a people-centric, people-driven sort of policy, to being a police-enforced lockdown. So that became an example of the state being too present. So the big paradox, as I always see, and if we hold that slide for a moment, let me tell you the story of this factory, the next one. This is a factory in the capital where a worker actually sent me an SOS message on Twitter. And he said that the workers had been imprisoned. The latches you see on the gate, there were workers who were locked up inside, and there was a board outside, and they would let the workers out like they were sheep for 1 hour in a day, that you can go use the bathroom, you can go and get your chai, something like that. Otherwise, they were locked in by these factory owners. And when we went to this factory, and you can keep the slides going now, when we went to this factory, we were locked into, along with the workers. There you can see, these were the locks behind which the workers were just locked in. This is the kind of, and this says gate khulne ka samay. So this is when the gates were opened for the workers to be let out. So we were literally treating them like chattel. And when I say we, I mean, I'm of course loosely talking about our structures of power, whether it was private, big factory owners. This is how they all lived in the open. They wanted to go home, but those who owned their factory had locked them behind these barricades. Now, one of the things that we heard a lot about this pandemic was the virus is the great equalizer. The virus does not differentiate between rich and poor. The virus doesn't distinguish between men and women. The virus doesn't distinguish between castes. None of this is true. What I found in the reporting of the pandemic for 2 years is that the virus was the opposite of the great equalizer. It wrenched open all of our existing inequalities. Women suffered more than men, sometimes for reasons extraneous to the virus, domestic abuse, having to handle home and work, Girls got pushed into child marriages because in rural areas they fell out of the school system. If there was a home which had one phone and one internet connection and there was a boy in that home, the boy would be allowed to attend the class and the girl would not. At the bottom of the caste hierarchy, Dalit neighborhoods in any case had very little access to public health systems and so on, and so they suffered even more. And then you had families like this who made 4 trips to the border to try and get home, to try and cross the border, and this time the police would just not let them through, and they would keep sending this poor woman, Seema, back with her 3 children, and she would walk 20 kilometers every day and walk back, and then eventually she walked a few hundred kilometers home. And you know, one of the things that I realized while reporting this is my own mea culpa moment. You know, as a journalist who has spent all my life covering either war, foreign policy, or politics, I was very far removed from the issues of social justice and actually from the issues of people. And then I discovered that 1 hour from India's capital, and the book opens with this chapter, is called The Village with Yellow Water. At that time, we were urging everybody, please wash your hands, you know, as a means to protect yourself from COVID. Just stay on that slide for a moment, I want to tell that story, yeah. So I went to this village, and the villagers came to me and they said there was no potable drinking water. So these were all daily wagers who had lost their work, but to drink water, they would have to buy water at 10 rupees a bottle, and that is because they were in sort of the heart of a factory belt where the factory's chemicals had contaminated the water supply. So the water was not potable, but guess what? Even the water that came in the supply was yellow, and when the villagers would wash their hands with it, their skin would burst into rashes down their back, on their face, anything where the water touched the surface. So they couldn't even wash their hands. And for me, that was a realization that in some ways as a journalist, I had moved very far away from the issues that mattered to people on an everyday basis. And for me, this was a rediscovery of the reasons that I became a journalist. It was also me finding my own path again. Let's go to the next slide. If we can go to the next slide. You know, this lady's name is Poonam, and one of the things you'll find in my book is that everybody I write about has a name. I didn't want anybody to be a statistic, and the one thing that I found in the telling of this story, of this pandemic, was that literally, you know, Ravi was talking about the trolls and people were saying, why are you going to cremation grounds? Why are you going to graveyards? Why are you invading the privacy of these people? Literally, the one thing common to every single person I met, whether it was Delhi, Bangalore, Tamil Nadu, and I traveled 30,000 kilometers in the first wave by road from Delhi to Kerala, everybody, the one thing they said, no matter how deep their suffering was, is that they didn't want those they loved to die unacknowledged, untold, and unchronicled. And they wanted their stories told, and this book is for all of them. And this was the first starvation death that I reported on during the pandemic. This is Poonam, the widow of Mukesh Mandal. Mukesh Mandal was a house painter who used to make money by doing odd jobs at construction sites, painting on construction sites. And when he lost his income immediately because of the lockdown, he sold the only asset he had, which was his phone. And he sold his phone for 2,000 rupees. And with those 2,000 rupees, he bought a table fan because it was very hot for his family. He bought a little bit of wheat grain and rice, wheat lentils and rice. He went home, he gave it to his wife, and he was so traumatized by what he saw in his future that he took his wife's scarf and he tied himself to the bamboo pole of his one-room tenement and took his own life. And the next day when we got to know of this and we went to meet the family, we found that the family was illiterate. They'd been made to put a thumbprint on an affidavit that said that Mukesh was mentally unstable and therefore had taken his life, whereas the family said, we didn't know what we were made to sign on, but they were basically threatened and told, you better be quiet, otherwise we can file a criminal case against you. So I tell you these stories, and we can move on with the slides, to tell you that that's Mukesh. There was nothing else that I learned that was a bigger lesson in this pandemic than how stratified, how hierarchical we still are as a country, and how COVID wrenched open every single inequality. And I remember in Mumbai, meeting a domestic help worker, and she was not being allowed into the high-rise buildings where she used to earn a living by mopping the floors and cleaning the dishes. And she said, I'll say it in Hindi and then I'll translate it. She said, ये क्या बात है? अमीर आदमी वायरस को लेके आता है एरोप्लेन पर और गरीब आदमी सड़क पर है. What is this? How is this fair? The rich man got the virus on an aeroplane from outside to India, and the poor person is on the street. So that is, I could go on, but I think we'll leave some of our conversation, and we can keep the slides maybe in the background as I speak to Ambassador Rao. I just want to end on a personal note about Bangalore. When I was here, there's certain people I met here, and they stay with me all the time. And I met a young girl called Bharini. And Bharini had lost her biological parents when she was a child in an accident. So she'd been adopted. And during COVID, she lost both her adoptive parents. And one of the things that she said to me, and she was, I think, 20, and she said to me, Barkha, how strong am I expected to be? I'm just so sick of people telling me, be strong. What does it mean, be strong? How strong am I expected to be? And then here in this city, I met Raghu. Raghu worked in the IT sector. Raghu's wife was 6 months pregnant and about to deliver, they hoped, their second child. He had a 9-year-old daughter. And he didn't want to tell his daughter that his mother had COVID and had been hospitalized. So he told his daughter, your mother has gone to heaven to fight COVID with goddess Durga. When the mother died, obviously the 6-month still to be born child died with her, or was actually extracted and had to be then buried separately. Raghu did not have the courage. He didn't know what to tell his daughter. He was absolutely mentally broken down, and he did not have the courage to actually go and bury his own stillborn baby. And so a volunteer group of Muslims actually stepped in. I think they own a restaurant chain here called Beijing Bites, and they stepped in, and they took this little baby, and they went and buried this baby in a Hindu crematorium. And this was the time when our television channels were hate-mongering, trying to drive a wedge between religious communities, running hashtags like Corona Jihad. But on the ground, what I found is that people stood with each other. People transcended these divisions. People really reached out to each other, and people felt they only had each other. And you will find many such stories of hope. There is heartbreak in the book, but there are many such stories of hope. There's many such stories of humanism. It's also a personal account for me and what I went through when the news came home and my father got COVID. But mostly, I think it's a story about my country, a country I love very much, and therefore I take the right to point out what I think is wrong with us, because that criticism comes from a place of love, because this is my country and I won't let anybody else tell me that I am anti-national for calling out what I think we need to make better for us to be a better people. So thank you. And I leave the rest, I think, for our conversation, because there are a lot of slides and I could go on. I just want to say that I know that there's a lot of unaddressed sorrow that we carry with us. And when I was writing this book, I broke down more times than I could count, and I almost abandoned it. I called my publisher Chiki Sarkar many times, and I said, I can't write the book. I'm not able to do it. And after I wrote it, I'm not saying that I feel happy these days. I think I still carry a lot of sorrow inside me. But I do feel that something has come out of me. And that is why I would say that in all the fatigue that we feel from the pandemic, and I was not a fan of the lockdown as an instrument of containing COVID. I'm all for getting on with life. But one of the things that I have learned is that moving on does not and should not mean forgetting. And I don't care about the politics of it. I don't care about the BJP and the Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party and the whatever, the TRS. And for me, that's not important. For me, it's important that people are allowed to ask more of their systems, whoever is in power. People are allowed to ask more of their hospital system. I have seen people die on the road outside the gates of hospitals that didn't have room for them. I have seen what I thought I would never see in my living life, a gurdwara running what's called an oxygen langar. Gurdwaras usually give food in their langars. Gurdwaras across the country started giving oxygen in their langars. It was like a drive-through, so they would put these oxygen cylinders on the road. Cars would drive in. They couldn't get hospital admissions, so they would come to these gurdwaras. Some really distraught patient would lie at the back of their, the car seat, or sometimes even in a rickshaw or a motorcycle. A mask would be clasped to this person. They would breathe for half an hour and then they would go away. It was the most dystopian thing I have ever seen. Every horrible science fiction movie that we saw on Netflix actually came true. If you think about it, if we'd seen a movie like this 10 years ago, Contagion or something like that, we would have said, how can this happen? This is so implausible. So all I want to say is that The Humans of COVID is a book about all of us. It's about the 9-year-old boy who I asked very playfully, do you know what COVID is? He said, yes. And I said, what is it? And he said it in Hindi and I'll translate. He said, coronavirus ka matlab hai mujhe khana nahi milta. COVID means I don't get food. And this was a 9-year-old's understanding. Very simple, very basic. It said more than this entire book can. So, for me, this is about some of our anger. It's about some of our suffering. It's about some of our love. It's about some of our hope. It's about some of our resilience. It's about the intimacy of strangers, the kindness of people you don't know. It's about getting up and keeping on going and moving on. But in remembering lies healing, and that is why I wrote this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Barkha. And first of all, congratulations on this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think it's epic in every sense of the word, because you not only traveled the length and breadth of our country and talked to the humans of COVID, but I loved the elegance with which it's been written. And the images you're able to conjure up, everything comes alive. It's a set of moving pictures. I was reminded in many ways of that exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, which I've heard about in New York in 1954, called The Family of Man, one of those classics. And I think this is well set on its way to become a classic, because it chronicles the suffering and the daily lives of people, the unknown Indians, the ordinary people on the ground, and the way they were affected.
Thank you so much.
As another, something else that came to mind was another famous account of pestilence, if you can call it that. Yeah. And that's Albert Camus' book, The Plague. Yes. And I wanted to just read out just a little paragraph from it. And I think that evokes, in many ways, all that you bring alive in your book. And this is what Camus says. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world. Yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky, which is just how this happened. There have been as many plagues as wars in history. Yet, always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. We tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away, but it doesn't always pass away, and from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away. They fancied themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. And I think, we keep telling ourselves that COVID is behind us. We really don't know. I think there is that uncertainty that hangs as a kind of a coda to this story, even as we speak of being liberated from the pandemic. There were a few things that I thought we can trigger off our discussion with. Of course, you said in your remarks, you talked about the fact that this is a human story. And the words that you use, I wanted to quote, about victims, survivors, and heroes, bereaved, bereft, and brave, about the journey to hell and back. And I think you brought that alive with the slides and what you had. to talk about. But I think something that struck me was, your reference to the giant, glaring ethical crater in this lockdown, the way it was handled, and the fact that our society is so stratified, so hierarchical, and that the inequities in what we are as a society, even as, just as you said, we love this country and this is where we belong. And the fact that these inequities just widened, it was as if the chasms widened and the fissures widened, and how are we going to mend that? And how do we, what kind of atonement can we make to the people who suffered so much? I was reminded of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. People escaping the Dust Bowl, going, they went to California and they were shortchanged there too. And there's been a giant shortchanging that has happened, I believe, in all that you had to, when you talked about how people had suffered. One point I thought I'd ask you about was the frontline health workers in this pandemic, and the doctors and the nurses and the hospital assistants and workers who paid for all this with their lives. And their stories, their chronicles are often unsung and untold, but you talk about it in your book. Would you like to say something about that?
Yes, thank you. I think those references to Steinbeck and Camus are very, very powerful. And when you were talking about the sky, I was reminded of how we were so tone deaf in the beginning of this pandemic that we actually gave the sky, which was cleaner than usual because there were no vehicles on the road, a color. We called it COVID blue. And in the beginning, our Instagram feeds, and I say our, please note that this is not me sitting in judgment on you or anyone else. I include myself in the privilege and the elitism that I represent. Our Instagram pictures were full of how beautiful our cities were looking, how lovely they were shorn of this vehicular pollution, as if this pestilence had taken us back to sort of where, the world had started, but completely oblivious of the fact that while we were able to stay at home, there were people out there walking the streets and dying on the way. The health workers, I'm reminded of a nurse, and I write about her in the book called Yogita, whom I met in a Bombay hospital. And she actually was on duty in the same hospital that had been taken siege during 26/11, the Mumbai attacks. And Ajmal Kasab, who was one of the 10 terrorists who laid siege to Mumbai, had actually stormed into this hospital with his AK-47, and Yogita was on duty in the neonatal ward, which means that she was in charge of young mothers and newborn babies. And there was Kasab there with his guns, and she had such quick thinking. She said, let me turn off the lights, we'll hide, but what if someone's phone rings? So she quickly confiscated all the phones, turned them all off, and they hid there. And well, long story cut short, there was a lot of firing that took place in the hospital, but she was able to save all the mothers and babies. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because she told me, I saw 26/11, but I find COVID more difficult. I was there when Kasab came in with his AK-47. I could have died that night, but COVID, it doesn't end. That was the perspective of a health worker. For her, it was day after day, night after night, and it didn't end. And I was just so struck by that. And then I remember interviewing a doctor who went to bury his best friend, who was a doctor who hadn't stopped work. By the way, in the beginning of the pandemic, initially, a number of doctors stopped coming to work because only emergency surgeries and COVID was being treated. But this doctor kept seeing his patients, and he contracted COVID from one of them, and then he died. And his best friend, along with his wife, went to bury him in the church cemetery that he wanted to be buried at, or he had wanted to be buried at, and they were attacked. They were attacked with stones and with bricks, and their ambulance was smashed, the hearse carrying the body was smashed. They went to 2 different crematoriums, and they were attacked, and he could not bury his friend. And I remember doing an interview with him where with folded hands he was weeping and he was saying, are we not humans? Now you would think a lot has changed since we emerged from the shadows of this pandemic, But 2 weeks ago, unconnected to COVID, I interviewed a doctor whose wife was forced to take her own life. Why? Because this is a village in Rajasthan where a young woman in her 20s called Asha Berwa is about to deliver her 4th baby. The first 3 are daughters, so of course there's a pressure on her now to produce a boy. So she's to deliver her child. She's in her 20s. She's already had 3 children. She's not in the best reproductive health. She's brought to this hospital. She dies from postpartum hemorrhage after delivering the baby. The husband is a poor laborer. He takes the body back home quietly. The local politicians get into the act. They go to this home and they say, you must go back, take the body and sit in front of the hospital and don't move from there till, there's justice. The next day, the newspapers report that there's a murder case filed against the doctors, and the gynecologist who helped deliver this child is so terrified that she takes her own life. So I just thought of this because, we made so much of how we value our health workers, and they are our heroes, and we stand in this moment of national solidarity, and we light our diyas, and we bang our thalis, and we clap for them. But the truth that was happening on the ground is the level of stigma and prejudice. Nurses were being evicted from rented properties. There were stickers put outside homes of serving doctors. There was a woman in Surat who had to actually tweet the Prime Minister because she happened to be from Gujarat, saying that the man who lived across the sort of landing from her would attack her every time she would come home from hospital and say, leave this building. So of course there was a lot of selfless heroism because, by the way, most of the doctors at the front line were volunteers. None of them, or many of them, were not infectious disease specialists. They had volunteered their services. Like in war, and I did cover a war. In many ways, I think Kargil and COVID are sort of the 2 bookends of my 2 decades in journalism. If in the Kargil war, the 24-year-old soldier was the backbone of India's response, in COVID, the 24-year-old resident doctor was the backbone of India's response. And if you were to see what people are paid in public health hospitals, our doctors who work in our public health system, I mean, a shout out to them more than anybody else, because they don't even do this because at some point they'll earn well. They're never going to earn well. And one of the things that struck me was also to re-examine, sorry, this answer's a bit long, I'll just stop after this, to re-examine the way we in media cover stories. So I'll tell you, there was a hospital where there were these patients being treated on the floor. And patients had got cardboard strips from their home, and there were no beds, so they would lie on the cardboard strip, and sometimes there were 2 corpses to a stretcher, sometimes there were 3 patients to a bed. And the initial sort of media response was to say, this is a scam, this is a scandal, this is so terrible. And then I remember interviewing a bunch of doctors, and they said to me, what would you rather have us do? Send them back? Or just treat them where we can? This is the space we have. This is the space we have. We'd rather that we get them some help there on that hospital floor, on that foyer, 2 people to a bed, and it's very easy for you to vilify us, but think of what we're going through. And I remember one doctor saying, I feel like I've been sent to fight a nuclear war with a lathi. And I just think we haven't acknowledged it enough. We've done this sort of, token acknowledgement. We have no idea of what our health workers, in particular nurses, doctors still have recognition. Nurses, ward boys, security staff in hospitals.
In fact, you mention in the book that at the end of 2021, the Indian Medical Association said 1,700 doctors in the country had died from COVID. And for a country such as ours, that is a national loss. I mean, it's a loss of national assets, literally,
And the other thing is that, this is a city of, you all know data in this city, right? The other thing that really upsets me about this pandemic is the unwillingness. Okay, we look at numbers when we do COVID dashboards. That's the one time when we shouldn't be looking at numbers, we should be looking at people. But when we should be looking at data, when we want to ask how many people actually died from COVID, we actually don't know the answer. We have an official figure, and then we have figures that tell us, and I can vouch to this anecdotally from just the number of crematoriums and graveyards I went to and how I tallied that with the official figure, we know that the number could be as much as 10 times higher.
Yeah, and on the banks of the Ganga, another Operation Ganga, very different, I'm afraid.
An Operation Ganga where I remember meeting a boatman who said to me that he had seen so many bodies floating in the river that he couldn't take his boat out anymore because he said it made him sick in the stomach. He couldn't count the bodies anymore. And, we had mass shallow graves of abandoned bodies, of bodies that couldn't be cremated because people didn't have money for woodwork, for the wood needed for the cremation. Stigma. In rural India, there was a lot of stigma. Nobody wanted to own up to the fact that you're seeing some of those. I actually compared it to a Jackson Pollock painting, and I said, if you see it from the top, from a drone perspective, it looks like these little speckles of orange. But when you actually go into these riverbanks, as I did, they're actually the Ramnami Chadar, which is the sort of Hindu sacred chadar that is, whoever came and left the bodies remembered to leave a chadar and a coconut, and then they ran away. And they just left the bodies. Some threw them into the river. And there is no documentation of this. There is no documentation of the number of people who died because oxygen ran out in hospitals where very poor people, Nirupama, had sold every little asset that they owned, a piece of land, a piece of jewelry, whatever they had, phones. Phones were the first asset that everybody sold. And the poor thought that if they go to private hospitals, they'd get better treatment. And then in these private hospitals in the second wave, the oxygen ran out. And when the hospital gave the discharge summary, they just said cardiac arrest. So you're not counted as a COVID death. You're not counted as an oxygen shortage death. So you're not counted as among the dead. And the last category of people who are not counted in the dead are people who had other fatal diseases, typhoid, tuberculosis, kidney disease, heart ailment, cancer, who could not get access to the health system because the health system was just completely overrun by COVID patients. And I think they're pandemic deaths too, but they'll never be counted.
Absolutely. Let's move briefly to the question of vaccines. And you talk about the fact that the government, the establishment, was obsessed with the idea of a made-in-India vaccine. And also the calculation that vaccines could be used, and here we're going into geopolitics a little, your field, as much as it is mine, that vaccines could be used as an instrument of strategic soft power. And you speak of a stumble by the government on this front, a grave mistake on the COVID response, because it simply failed to place a bulk order or import a substantial number of vaccines. And I think that story needs to be told. Of course, it's out there in the public domain. It's not that you're disclosing something that is a state secret. But this whole, were we able, and one would have hoped, at least that is a hope that all of us who believe in South Asian integration always have nurtured, that a pandemic of this sort, a health emergency of this sort, could have broken barriers and could have moved beyond geopolitical differences to construct an image of integration, a reality of more integration. And that, of course, did not happen, maybe because the way the pandemic developed, everything was so uncertain. But in terms of, just being able to communicate doctors, scientists, and leaders, just speaking to each other, don't you think this could have been an opportunity?
So I'll be honest, the first time I saw Indian Air Force planes leaving with cartons of made in India vaccines for Nepal and Bangladesh, I felt very proud. It's not that is not a compelling narrative. I think there's something very powerful about, and you would know this better than anybody else. But what we did not know at this point is that we simply hadn't ordered enough vaccines for our own people. And I think that there is no ambiguity in our mind that we first owe something to our own. And look at the West. Look at how America sat, I think, unethically on bulk vaccines, just thinking that they had to have reserve stocks for their own people, even with sort of the big anti-vax movement, even with the failure to mandate vaccines, which raises all kinds of ethical questions. And I think that, there's a whole chapter on vaccines in this book, which talks about how at least one of the two vaccine makers in India, the Serum Institute, was urging the government from September of 2020 to place an order for vaccines. And that first order for vaccines is placed in January. And the number of vaccines that are ordered are actually not enough to inoculate even half of the adult population of one city. And that is the number of vaccines that are actually ordered, and they're ordered in the January of 2021. And even then, the orders continue to remain incremental, whereas the vaccines were available. It is extremely important to say that the vaccines were available well before they were ordered. And at least one set of the vaccines were available before they were ordered. And because Mr. Poonawala had declared, I think in October of 2020, that he would have those vaccines to roll out, by the end of the year, and he did, but they were just never ordered. I think that we got obsessed with a kind of national pride thing when we didn't need to. And I don't mean to undermine India's scientists in any way on this. I'm all for innovation and research, but a crisis is not the time when you get obsessed with this has to be developed in India. That's a long-term response. We have now seen, and it's documented, that Covaxin wasn't able to meet its volume targets. The government had to keep modifying in the Supreme Court in its own affidavits how much supply would come from Covaxin. There have been other issues. Most recently, the World Health Organization has put a pause, wanting upgradations in Covaxin's facilities. And I just think we got into these sort of banal, are you a patriot or are you not a patriot because you're going to take Covishield or Covaxin? The fact is 90% of India has been vaccinated by Covishield.
And Covishield manufactured in India, in any
Covishield
case.
Manufactured, not developed, is still an India story. Yeah. I think it's still a great India story. But we somehow got obsessed with this. And then, of course, the basic price we paid was the delusion of exceptionalism. The belief between the first and the second wave that the second wave was just not going to be lethal. And therefore, we didn't have to order these vaccines. And when you're in the middle of a surge, a vaccine, no matter how many vaccines you order, the vaccine is not going to take you out of that moment. So I think, I just want to add one other thing. When the vaccine program did take off, this is something we know how to do. There are very, very inspiring images of, in the remotest corner, of our health workers, our community health workers. Highest mountain, across rivers, in forests. We are a country which manufactures 60% of the world's vaccines. We are a country that pioneered mass immunization. We did this successfully with polio. We know how to do this. We just didn't order them. We just didn't order them in time. When it took off, it's so smooth.
Absolutely. And many success stories now. So
yes.
In that sense, I suppose there are self-correcting mechanisms, as
we
they
kept
say,
learning.
in
we
Indian
kept learning
democracy.
from the mistakes.
Yeah.
Like the refusal to impose a national lockdown, the fact that we didn't shut public transport down in the second wave like we had in the first.
That's true.
So we did learn, but we learned at great cost.
That's right. Well, you've spoken about how your father passed away from COVID and how when a single person is missing for you, the whole world is empty. You quoted Joan Didion. And how is it that you were able to muster the strength and the courage to go on with it? And I haven't finished my question. What is it that makes a woman journalist like you, able to just move out of the safety of your confines in the nation's capital to walk and literally travel the length and breadth of India, where I think very few male journalists have really trodden. I was seeing the documentary that made it to the Oscars, was shortlisted, about Khabar Lahariya, this channel in Bundelkhand, of all women from the rural areas, and it was so inspiring. So I am so happy here, sitting with you as a woman, to commend you for what you did. And I hope this will inspire many more young women to come, as I could see from the Khabar Lahariya story also.
Thank you for that. When my father got COVID, I was in Gujarat. I was reporting on the second wave, and my sister called me to say, our father's got COVID. And initially, the thought was to treat him at home. He was in his 80s, but of reasonably good health. And I didn't go back. And I say this, I didn't immediately go back. And I say this because it haunts me, the guilt. Could anything have been different had I gone back? I just kept working, and I was remotely sort of monitoring.
I'm sure that's what he would have wanted you to do.
And he would have, but the guilt eats you, I think somewhere in the book I say memory's a beast, and it just eats at you, and even today it eats at me. But I kept working, and I found that the irony of my life was that I had spent 2 years, I had met more COVID patients like at this distance, because I had reported from the inside of ICUs, in slum tenements, inside packed trucks, trains, walking with them. But when it came to my father, eventually we had to hospitalize him. When it came to trying to meet him in hospital, obviously as a daughter, what you're allowed to do as a journalist, you're not allowed to do as a patient's daughter. And I respect that. But I couldn't meet him, whereas I had met, a gazillion strangers whom I didn't know who had COVID, just like this, like sitting at this much of a distance. And when his fever spiked, of course, I went back home, and the doctors wanted to hospitalize him. And I think I found it surreal because the news came home. I became the story I'd been reporting for a year and a half. And I remember panicking at that time, saying, the hospital, and here I have to acknowledge, again, my privilege, I was able to call a Naresh Trehan and say, can you get him a bed? And he said, yeah, bring him over. And I was very mindful of the number of people who I had documented dying on the road. I like, with my eyes, I have seen them outside locked doors of hospitals, dying on the way, on the road. But for my father, I was going to use my privilege, and I got him that bed. But he was supposed to go into a general ward, because he wasn't considered that ill at that time. And then the hospital didn't have an ambulance at that time, so we decided to approach a private agency. What arrived was a second-hand Maruti van, repurposed as an ambulance. It didn't have a paramedic. It had one driver and a big oxygen cylinder. I thought twice, should I not? And then I panicked, so I jumped into the front seat. My father, we placed on the strip at the back. We put the oxygen on him. By the time he reached the hospital, that cylinder malfunctioned. The cylinder did not deliver the oxygen that he needed. His levels plummeted. He was taken into ICU, and that was the last time I saw him. 5 days later, he died. And when we had to cremate him near the nearest cremation ground to the hospital, because otherwise we were crossing borders and we needed police permission to get his body back home. So we couldn't even get his body back home. And at the cremation ground, there was so little space that there was a fight that erupted between families for space. We had to approach the police, get help from the police, somehow managed to cremate him. I came home and I tested positive for COVID that day, the day my father died. Then I sat myself in the basement and I didn't know what to do with my grief and with my COVID. So I kept working. I'd been out there, but now I kept doing these sort of, studio shows. And I know everybody looked at me like, what is wrong with you? You're not even pausing. And I said, I feel like if I pause, I will break down. It was more like, if I stop, this will demolish me. And so I spent my 14 days, got over it somehow, and then went out to the mass graves of the Ganga, and that's when my Ganga journey began. How did I do it? I don't know. I think it's running away from grief, but it's also looking for meaning in death. How do I feel it's the best way to honor his memory, of course, is to keep working. It's the only thing that made sense at the time.
Yeah, like he let you go to Kargil.
It's sad, but I think we appreciate these things. I grew up with a very powerful role model in my mother, who died when I was 13. She was a trailblazer journalist of her time, India's first woman war correspondent. She covered the 1965 war. And all my life, maybe because she had died when I was so young, I always thought of her as the heroic parent. you know. I never thought of my poor dad, this single parent, kind, benign, gentle, generous man to 2 daughters. And after he died, I thought, my God, the freedom he gave to my sister and me to go cover, you know, to cover war, to cover COVID, sometimes and often at expense, you know, of time spent with him. And the book is dedicated to him, and I carried on reporting because I thought it was the only way to give meaning to losing him.
That's right. Well, there's so many things to ponder about in this very grief-filled period for many of us. But there are, you know, stories of hope that you speak about, and stories that seem to reaffirm one's faith in humanity. You know, the officials who delivered, who had the oxygen ready. You spoke of this gentleman in Nandurbar in Maharashtra, I think, who had, you know, enough oxygen perhaps for his own district and much more, because he had forethought about it. And you speak about local reporters from Hindi newspapers and regional language publications who stood out for their shoe leather reportage. And instead of being celebrated, they were also abused and vilified. And then, despite the breakdown of community structures, extraordinary displays of courage and compassion that you speak of. So, in a sense, there is so much hope that comes out of this narrative also. It's not a story of just despondency and despair and death.
And I'm glad you flagged that, because a lot of people have told me, you know, we really want to read your book, but it seems so sad and depressing. And while there's all of that, there's real hope in it. There are real heroes in it. And, you know, we're in Karnataka. I remember meeting this collector from Dharwad, and she had managed to contain the exodus of migrant workers in her district because she quickly used all the youth hostels and house the workers there. And then she said, you know, I didn't feel that was enough. I felt that I had to do something more to acknowledge them as people. So the otherwise closed Khadi Udyog, she used them to quickly overnight stitch clothes. And she said, I don't know why I did that. It seems very airy-fairy, but I felt like I had to humanize that. It wasn't just the largest of the state to these poor people. I had to treat them as people. Then there was, as you mentioned, the collector in Nandurbar, Maharashtra, who was a doctor who grew up in poverty. He was a doctor before he became a civil servant. And he grew up in a hut as the son of an Adivasi mother who had no money. And he'd seen poverty, and he understood after the first wave, and everyone thought the second wave would never come, that the second wave will come. And he quickly used his allocated budget, nothing very much, 80 lakh rupees, part of his annual budget, to build 2 liquid oxygen plants, and was able to save lives. And like this Bhilwara, there were so many, you know, so many bureaucrats really shone. They really, and the power of local governance, you know, we have local governance units for a reason. And COVID tested them, and where they worked and when they worked really well. But there were also other heroes. There was Abdul Malbari, who runs a small trust called the Ekta Trust in Gujarat. He has an ambulance, and on the ambulance it says, funerals for lonely humans. And he basically performs the last rites for those who have no families. And in COVID, what we saw is that people were so scared that they were just leaving bodies, right, as we know. Right. And he would go, whether Hindu, Muslim, and he would go and cremate or bury these bodies. Then I remember in housing societies, women deciding, you know, we don't know what to do, but if we're cooking 5 rotis today, we will cook 5 extra rotis and let them go into a bag, a collection bag, and let that go now. By now, we had relief camps for migrant workers and so on. Also, just the way social media, you know, we talk so much about trolling and toxicity. I actually found people really kind. You know, when I was traveling in the first wave and I had no food, no place to stay, people off Twitter said to me, we know a place here, you can stay here. If you're here, our home is open for you. And I actually used some of those offers. My shoes broke, there were no stores open. People sent me shoes, people sent me food all the time. And people rallied to each other's help. There was it was very, I say that, it was like Charles Dickens, right? It was the best, so it wasn't the best of times, but it showed the best of human spirit and the worst of human spirit. Exactly. And it was in that paradox that we navigated these 2 years.
Absolutely. I think we should allow the audience perhaps to ask some questions. So if anybody would like to ask Barkha a question, please do. to identify yourself and use the mic.
If one sees the apathy shown towards the migrants, the negligence shown in the second wave, one would think those affected people would be very angry about what happened. But somehow we don't seem to see this anger appearing. And the government that failed these people is still winning elections. So do you have any explanation of why that is so?
It's a very interesting question, and I remember in the second wave when I was traveling across Uttar Pradesh and I came back, a number of my friends in the media asked me, oh, there must be a lot of anger. And I said to them that there was no anger. I encountered no anger. And they said, why? And I said, there was such fatalistic resignation that this was somehow what their lives were about. And what it taught me was that India's poorest citizen does not expect that much better from the health system, from the systems of power. And in some ways, I found that so depressing, because I think that, you know, most of us in this hall have not suffered in that way that we can't get access to a doctor or a hospital. But the really poor person, this is probably their everyday life, even when a pandemic is not on. You know, when we go to All India Medical Institute in Delhi, you see these people sitting on the pavement outside waiting, their cancer patients waiting for their turn to get a doctor's appointment. It's kind of complicated, the politics of it. There are many reasons that the BJP keeps winning elections, and there's no one reason that explains it. A lot has to do also with the laziness of the opposition. I would have thought that the COVID was the one time when, for example, if I had seen a non-BJP leader walk among the workers, at that time when there were just a handful of people with them, maybe something would have been different. But I guess in our country, even those who criticize the ruling party come only after the worst is over. So that doesn't say very much to the voter. But mostly I can explain it only by telling you that there was abject fatalism in the people I met. Like, most people believe that this is something larger than life that's happening. The whole world is suffering. So it's our lot to suffer too. There was no rage. There was great helplessness and deep fatalism and deep resignation.
Our kind of great resignation.
Yes, our kind of great resignation.
But in the second wave, it wasn't just the poor who suffered.
Yeah, I call the second wave the 2611 of the pandemic, because it was our class that suffered. But how we vote and why we vote, I think this room can tell us better. I'd love to hear from Karnataka, where I'm extremely concerned about economic livelihood of minorities being under assault in different parts of the state. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to transcend this party or that party and stand up for issues. And just very few of us do that anymore.
Hello, Barkha. Really glad to see you. You know, we were very excited in the morning to, you know, we have, like, since childhood I've watched you on TV. Very, very big fan of you. Thank you very much for writing a beautiful book. We'll surely try to read it. But my question here is, what were your thoughts when you were going through? So what happens as a human when you are covering such stories? Like, you're seeing so much pain already. Like, people are dying, people are not getting food to eat. Yeah. Somebody's, riding bicycles for kilometers and kilometers to reach their hometowns. But then you are not stopping your work. You're, holding that camera on everybody's face and asking this, that, this, that. Does this feel bad to you? Like, of course, you're a journalist, no doubt on that part. But does it feel bad that I shouldn't do that, No. Like, what was that's the question.
I think consent is at the heart of all journalism. So you don't thrust a mic in the face of someone who's suffering. But you do pause to say, would you like to talk? And you'd be astonished, everybody wants to talk. Yeah. People want to talk. People want to be acknowledged. People don't want to be invisible. People don't want to be forgotten, slip through the cracks of a country's collective memory and just, or rather collective amnesia is perhaps a better word. And do I feel weird that I can cover this abject poverty, death, despair, and then go back and have a glass of wine? Yes, I feel weird. I do feel weird. And in the first wave, there was none of this. Nothing was open. But yes, in the second wave, hotels were open. And I did go back and have a hot shower and sometimes had a drink and a good meal. And that guilt is a structural guilt. And my way of processing it is that my work should be powerful enough to change something. I alone, I can, my putting one worker in the back of my car with me and taking her to the next 100 kilometers that I'm traveling is not going to change anything. I can't change my life to change her life, but I can do work that maybe will drive a policy that will change her life. And that is the best I can hope to do. What do you do in unequal, all of us deal with levels of inequality, right? I don't feel guilty about my work. I feel very proud of my work.
Yeah, totally. You must. I love your work, no doubt on that
Thank
part. But just one more question.
I think there's somebody
There's
else
somebody
waiting
Just
to
a quick-
ask
just
a
quick
question, so
please,
you
sorry,
must
just-
finish
okay.
because...
Thank you.
Hello, Barkha.
Hi.
It's a real pleasure to see you in person because I'm a big admirer of your work.
Thank
And I think it's absolutely very courageous what you've done, also in the face of personal loss.
Thank you.
So, yes. My question is that this coverage has been in a crisis situation. But you've mentioned some important markers like things like a humanistic approach, things like nurses, ward boys, and securities being an equally important part of the medical system, though not that much acknowledged, and strengths that we have in this country like the community health workers and the mass immunization strengths. So are there some markers that in your mind have emerged for the design of possibly a healthcare system for this country, not just for us to wake up in the next crisis situation, but perhaps just, as an everyday kind of healthcare system? Like, are there 2 or 3 things that are standing out for you that you would like to share?
I'll tell you the really small thing that stands out for me that we still haven't implemented is a green passage for ambulances.
Okay.
I mean, I remember sitting in that ambulance with my father, like I thought he was dying. And there were a row of ambulances, in front of me and behind me. And we still had police barricades at every 2 kilometers. No one knows why. There was no green passage for ambulances. The movement of ambulances in our cities, it's impossible. I know I've started with something so small.
Yes.
I've not spoken about health insurance. I've not spoken about macro policies like this. But to me, this is basic, that our ambulances cannot get anywhere on time.
Yes.
And how are our cities not designed or redesigned to accommodate this? For me, the other marker is just compensation and recognition for those who work in the public health system. We are going to lose our best talent to the private sector. I'm not dissing the private sector. I myself turn to the private sector quite often. But resident doctors are not paid uniformly across the country. They're paid very little. Working hours are very long. So, just to be able to respect monetarily health workers in a more meaningful way, I think is another marker. Third, I think that we should now have cities that are designed for crisis management, by which I mean that one of the mistakes we made in the first wave, which we learned in the second wave, is that in the first wave, all of our hospitals became COVID-only hospitals.
Okay.
And therefore, people who were suffering from anything else had nowhere to go. Whereas by the second wave, we learned that you can have field hospitals. It's something that the military does quite well. They're able to create hospitals on the go. And we are going to need increasingly in the times to come for any crisis. And the crisis can be, by the way, of any kind. It can be a natural calamity, it can be a war, or it can be another pandemic, God forbid.
Right.
But we need to think of giant spaces that can be refurbished as hospital spaces. And my last point, of course, would be that I do believe that we need right to health as a fundamental, health care as a fundamental right. And we need to go back to a more rights-oriented conversation about health as opposed to largesse by the state, as opposed to a healthcare system where most people in this country have to sell something. If you look at the data over the last 2 years, most people have sold something to be able to pay hospital fees. That is simply not acceptable. I mean, I think like we have a right to education, we need to have a right to healthcare.
Thank you very much.
So you are telling, you say you've been to hell and back.
Not just me, I think all of us.
Yeah, all of us. So are we done with COVID?
Look, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know about fourth waves and fifth waves, but I'll tell you that in the debris of COVID lie a lot of things that we haven't addressed. One is education. We just don't talk about it. We had the longest physical school lockdown in the world. Survey after survey shows that children have lost cognitive, emotional, social skills, language skills, memory retention skills. We have millions of children who have fallen out of the school system. We have, I went to Rajasthan where I found child marriage, which was very successfully being contained, and the numbers had actually fallen. A spike in those numbers because girls were no longer going to school, and therefore their parents were again pressuring them to get married at the age of 13, 14, 15. So there is that debris, and then there is the debris of economic distress. You go to the pawn shops in this country, especially the ones, gold stores. Go to any store that sells or trades in gold, and you will see how many people have either sold one little ring, one little earring, or pawned it just to make ends meet. You see military recruitment, which is not taking place. Go to the employment exchanges. I know that the world has been hit economically, but I think that we're in some sort of crazy denial. We have not begun examining what's under the rubble. Like after an earthquake, there's the rubble, and then you have to clear the wreckage to know what's under the wreckage. So I think we're at that stage in the pandemic where we're so relieved that we didn't die in the earthquake that we don't want to lift the rubble. And when we lift the rubble, I think, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot to deal with.
Thank you.
So even as we say that India as a country heals quickly, you think there is scar tissue from all of this?
I think there's a lot of scar tissue, and I think it's going to manifest itself in different ways, socially, economically. Yes, I think on the surface it feels normal because, as they say in my industry, the show must go on, and it should. But I think that we need to confront education, economic distress, what it's taught us about. Can you imagine another wave? And not of this, maybe something else will happen.
Absolutely.
And then what?
We won't be free as long as there are pestilences,
Yes.
as they say.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
One of the things that, to my mind, that you've done is you've just raised the standard of journalism in the country. And so the question I ask you is, given the narrative against it, and given the state of it just now, where do you think the future of it lies? Because if there is no journalism, there's no democracy. And I know it works both ways. So where do you think we're headed?
Well, thank you for that. And one of the reasons that I became an independent media entrepreneur, I run a digital platform, for those of you who don't know, called Mojo Story. Mojo means magic. I tried to rediscover for myself my mojo, which I think I had lost along the way. First is sort of acknowledgement of my fallibility. I think I had started doing one of the reasons I left television, there were many, but one of the reasons was I could do what I was doing in my sleep. It was so mechanical to me. I was efficient at a level 6 out of 10, like just on autopilot, and it was stale. I had become stale. And I knew that television, the way it is, doesn't speak to me anymore. It just doesn't speak to me. It doesn't trigger the hope in me that I had when I was 21 years old and became a journalist. But it is a very, very lonely path, as you mentioned. And everywhere I go, people tell me how much they despair at the state of broadcast journalism. I say broadcast because I do want to say the second wave saw some excellent sterling journalism in the language printed press and some excellent work in the digital media. So I just want to acknowledge that work done by my colleagues as well. But it is a lonely path because everybody complains about the state of television media. Either it's bigoted or it's banal. No one says anything much better about it. But people don't support the journalism they admire. And when I say support, I run a company that has no outside capital. We depend entirely on subscriptions and grants and people who've decided to support us. And you could support us for the price of one Starbucks coffee, if you gave us that much a month, you would be supporting journalism you believe in. So if you believe in this, and it's not just me, it could be anybody you like, just spend 300 rupees on journalism you believe in a month, and you'll be changing the face of your country.
Which also brings up the whole fact that technology has become such a force multiplier. You know, you're in digital media today, and 20 years ago when we first met, we couldn't have imagined this sort of thing happening.
And that's such a great question, because the only thing COVID was a great equalizer for was the big and the so-called small media, because everybody was online. So suddenly, if I sent you a link and said, join my show online, you didn't think I was the small guy because I hadn't come to you with the big OB van, because everybody was doing that.
You interviewed me from Ladakh after Galwan.
Yes.
You were
in the middle of this pandemic, I actually turned my car back from Bihar, went to Delhi. We thought there was going to be a war. I went to Ladakh. I interviewed Ambassador Rao sitting in the mountains of Ladakh with a dongle in my hand, and we streamed live.
And I was here in Bangalore.
And you were here in Bangalore. And that is what technology has done. It has opened doors for those with passion and commitment. And I think we must salute, like I'm so excited by the opportunities that are offered by technology. But now it's up to us as practitioners to grab it. And to all of you in the audience to please support, not me, but anybody you believe in and anybody whose work you believe in. So please do that, because the media is about you. It's not only about us. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, that's a lot of hands. Thank you, that's heartening.
Support a free and independent media.
Thank you, that's heartening to see. Thanks for asking that question, Rohini.
Well, I think, Barkha, we have come to the end. You've been scintillating as always. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. And, you know, this book, as somebody said, has been the axe that has broken the frozen sea inside you, all that you saw during these years. Thank you so much, and be blessed.